Eli, get up out of that wet grass. I'm calling the sheriff right now. Don't. They dumped 11 busted beehives at our fence at 5:30 in the morning, and you're telling me don't? The boy didn't stand up. He was 15, still in his pajama pants, kneeling in the mud counting cracked lids one at a time. Look at the bottom of that one, Mama. There's a number painted on it. They didn't even bother to hide who it belongs to. Then that's exactly why I'm calling. And he'll say he's happy to come haul it off. Then we'll owe him a thank you. He went inside, washed his hands, and opened his dead grandfather's journal to page 43. So what had the old man seen in that pile of trash? 6 months earlier, Amos Weathers had died in his sleep in the back bedroom of that farmhouse, in the same room where he had been born 71 years before. He left behind 38 acres of tobacco ground in Hardin County, Kentucky, a roof that leaked in 2 places, and a barn where every hand tool hung on pegboard inside an outline drawn in black marker, so a man could tell at a glance what was missing. He left 2 other things that mattered more than the acreage. The first was a bee smoker, brass-hinged, the metal gone soft brown with 40 years of smoke, the leather belt clip worn into the exact shape of his fingers. The second was a journal, cloth-bound in green, with a brass protector on the corner where his thumb had ridden it open. Inside, the handwriting was so precise, it looked typeset. Amos Weathers wrote the way he built things, with no wasted motion, and he had written down every inspection, every queen cycle, every split, and every loss for close to 5 decades. His grandson was 15 the spring the boxes appeared. Elijah Weathers, called Eli by everybody except his mother when she was tired, had grown 4 inches in a year and hadn't figured out where to put any of it yet. He was quiet in a way people misread. Teachers wrote disengaged on his reports. What he actually did, when the world got loud or uncertain, was count. Ceiling tiles, fence posts, the number of cars that passed on the county road between 6 and 7 in the morning. It was a habit that had started somewhere around the time his father stopped calling, and it had never gone away. And by the time he was 15, it had gotten so quiet inside him that nobody but his grandfather had ever noticed he was doing it. There was a scar on his left elbow, thin and curved like a fingernail moon. He'd gotten it at 9 years old, falling out of a hollow elm 2 miles up the ridge, because Amos had gone up first to look at a colony living in the cavity, and Eli had decided that whatever the old man could do, he could do behind him. Amos hadn't scolded him. He'd walked him home, cleaned the elbow at the kitchen sink, and said only that a man who climbs after somebody ought to check the branch himself instead of trusting the one who went before him. His mother, Denise, was 41 and worked as a nurse in Elizabethtown, mostly doubles, mostly nights, and she had not moved back to that farmhouse out of any love for the land. She moved back because the house was free. That was the entire reason, and she was honest enough to say it out loud. Rent in town had gone up twice in 3 years. Her father's house had 4 walls and a well and no mortgage on it, so she packed what fit in a hatchback and came home to a place she had spent her whole young life trying to get away from. By then, the tobacco program was gone. The allotment, the quota, the price support, all of it dried up and rolled away, and every neighbor within 3 miles told her the same thing inside the first 2 weeks. Sell it, honey. Without the program, that ground is just a tax bill with grass growing on it. What none of them said, because most of them didn't know it, was that the tax bill had been in the family since 1919. Eli's great-grandfather had bought those 38 acres with cash out of a coffee tin, because no bank in the county would write him a note. 4 generations had worked it. Across the country, most of the farmland black families owned at the start of that century was gone within 3 generations, and the losses mostly didn't come through anything as loud as violence. They came through paperwork. An estate with no will, an inheritance split 4 ways, then 12, then 30. 1 heir who wanted out, 1 attorney who knew the statute, and a forced sale on the courthouse steps that nobody in the family found out about until the signs went up. Amos knew that history the way other men knew scripture, and he never once lectured anybody about it. He just paid the taxes early every single year and kept bees. 12 colonies, all through the 1970s. He hived them himself from swarms he caught in hollow sycamores along the creek, and he built the boxes out of poplar he milled on a bandsaw bolted to the barn floor. He ran them clean. No chemical strips, no miticide, no fumigation, no imported queens. When the County Beekeepers Association organized itself in 1981 and voted to standardize apiston treatments for varroa mites, Amos refused. The chemicals breed resistant mites and weaken the queens. You're training the disease and killing the cure in the same motion. The association pulled his membership that same season. On page 38 of the Green Journal, at the bottom, in handwriting smaller than the rest of the entry, he had written one line about that meeting. They voted on the method, but they had voted on me before I opened my mouth. Eli read that line at 15 and understood maybe half of it. The bees didn't care about the vote. Amos ran 12 colonies through the 1980s and pulled between 60 and 90 pounds of honey per hive per season, while the association's treated hives averaged 42. He never mentioned that to anybody either. He wrote it down and let it sit there. Which brings up the man who was president of that association and had been for 9 years running. Dale Pomeroy was 52. Stocky through the chest with thinning sandy hair combed back like he was expecting a photographer. He wore a white polo tucked into pressed khakis with a small gold bee embroidered on the breast, the way another man might wear a service ribbon. Tortoiseshell reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. A clipboard in his left hand always, even in places where there was nothing on earth to write down. At the funeral, standing near the casket in polished tan loafers, Dale said this to the dead man's daughter. "He was a stubborn old fool, Denise. Set beekeeping in this county back 20 years. Somebody ought to have told him." He said it kindly. That was the part Eli never got over. He said it with a patient half-smile, chin a little elevated like he was doing the family a favor by explaining something to them. Eli stood 4 feet away and heard all of it. He didn't say a word. He counted the folding chairs. There were 29, and 11 of them were empty. He knew the truck before he knew anything else. A diesel Ford with a bad exhaust manifold has a specific sound, a hard, uneven knock under the idle, and by 5:30 that March morning, Eli had heard it enough times going past the property to recognize it through a closed window. What was different was that it stopped. The engine sat idling out past the orchard for 8 or 9 minutes. Then it pulled away and the road went quiet again. He was outside 2 minutes later in pajama pants and untied boots, and after he'd finished counting them, he did the thing the old man would have done, which was to kneel down in the wet grass and take inventory. The knees of his pants soaked through in under a minute. He didn't get up. 7 of the 11 had cracked bottom boards. 9 had inner covers so warped they wouldn't have sealed against a stiff breeze. The frames inside were black with old comb, years of it, layered and pressed like something geological. 3 boxes were missing an entire wall, and the wood had split along the grain where somebody had pried them apart in a hurry without caring what broke. This was association dead stock, equipment too far gone to keep in service and too expensive to run through the county waste facility, where the disposal fee was $75 a load. He knew that number because it was posted on a sign at the gate of the transfer station, and he had read it 40 times sitting in the truck beside his grandfather. Then he tipped the 4th box up onto its side to check the bottom, and everything about the morning changed. Stenciled across the underside in white paint, faded but perfectly legible, was a number. 14. He turned another one over. 9. Another. 22. Association inventory numbers, the same system they'd used since the 1980s, painted on so equipment could be tracked when it moved between members' yards during a bad season. It wasn't anonymous garbage. It had a return address on it. That was the part that sat in his chest. A man who dumps trash in the dark is a coward, and cowards cover their tracks. Dale Pomeroy hadn't bothered. He had backed a truck up to a fence at 5:30 in the morning and unloaded 11 numbered boxes belonging to an organization he had run for 9 years, and it had not once crossed his mind that anybody would do anything about it. Denise came out at 6:15 in her scrubs with her car keys already in her hand and stopped at the edge of the grass. "Get up. I'm calling the sheriff before I go in." Eli kept writing. He said the numbers were painted right on them, so it wouldn't be hard to prove who they belonged to.
Then that's exactly what I'm doing.
He stood up finally and wiped his hands on his thighs, and he told her what he'd already worked out in the 10 minutes he'd been out there. A deputy comes out, takes a look, asks if anybody actually saw the truck. I say I heard it. He writes down, "Heard it." Then he goes and talks to Mr. Pomeroy, and Mr. Pomeroy stands on his porch with that clipboard under his arm and says he has no earthly idea how association equipment ended up out on the Weathers place, and that he'd be happy to come haul it off if it's causing us trouble. And then we'd owe him a thank you. Denise stood there with the keys biting into her palm. She was late. She was always late in the direction of that hospital. "So what do you want to do instead?" "I want to think about it." "Fine." And she drove off. He went inside, washed the mud off his hands, and opened the green journal on the kitchen table to page 43. The entry on page 43 was dated March 1978, and it ran 3 paragraphs, and there was one sentence in the middle of it underlined twice in pencil, hard enough to dent the paper underneath. "A hive doesn't die. It gets abandoned." Eli read it 4 times. He did not understand it yet, not the way he would in 15 years, but he understood enough to know it wasn't about bees the way the rest of the page was about bees. He pressed his thumb against the words the way the old man used to, like a person reading through his skin, and then he closed the journal and left it on the table and went to school and thought about 11 boxes all day. The letter came that Friday. It was from a law office in Louisville, addressed to Denise, and it concerned the estate of Amos Weathers, deceased, and the interest held in the property by his son, Ray Weathers, of Detroit, Michigan. Ray had come down for exactly 1 day for the funeral, in a good coat, and had stood at the back of the room and left before the food came out. Eli had met him maybe 5 times in his life. Ray wasn't a villain. Ray was a 58-year-old man with a bad back, a daughter starting nursing school, and 1/3 of a hillside in Kentucky he had never wanted, and he had decided to convert it into money. The letter laid it out in the flat, reasonable way those letters do. Mr. Weathers wished to liquidate his interest. His sister was welcome to purchase it. The appraised value of his share came to $31,000. If no agreement was reached within 18 months, his counsel would file a petition for partition, and the court would order the entire property sold at auction and the proceeds divided. The whole thing, not his third, the whole 38 acres on the courthouse steps, to whoever showed up with a checkbook. Denise read it at the kitchen table near midnight, still in her scrubs, still smelling like the ward, with a cup of coffee she had poured 2 hours earlier and never touched. She read it twice and set it down and pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes. $31,000. She cleared about $29,000 a year before taxes, working every double they'd give her. Eli sat across from her and didn't say anything for a while. What happens if we just don't answer it? Then it happens anyway. And we're not even in the room when it does. She put the letter face down on the table, which was the closest she ever came to losing her temper. "You want to tell me how I'm supposed to keep it? Because I have been doing the arithmetic since I was 22 years old, Eli. It doesn't come out. It has never once come out." He didn't answer her with words. He turned in his chair and pointed out the dark kitchen window toward the fence line, where 11 boxes were sitting in the grass exactly where they'd been left. Not cruel, just wrecked. Oh, honey. It was the laugh of a woman who had been awake for 19 hours. So he went and got the piece of notebook paper he'd been writing on Tuesday morning in the wet grass, and he put it in front of her, and he walked her through it line by line. 7 bottom boards to rebuild, and 3 walls to replace, and there was a stack of old poplar behind the chicken coop his grandfather had bought in 1982 with the receipt still stapled to the top plank. $14 for enough lumber to build 6 hive bodies. He could mill what he needed on the bandsaw in the barn. Nails, wax, bladeware, hardware. He'd priced it twice. Under $100 for all 11. Under $100 for equipment a man had driven out in the dark and abandoned rather than pay $75 to throw away. Denise looked at that paper for a long time. She was not a woman who believed in signs, and she had watched her father keep bees her entire childhood and had never once seen it turn into money. September. You've got until September. 1 season. And if it hasn't turned into something real by then, I sign whatever that lawyer sends me, and you don't fight me on it, and we move back into town. That's the end of the conversation. And your grades don't slip. Not one of them. That part isn't up for discussion. Okay. The next morning before the bus, he carried the first box across the fence onto his own land, and the smell came up out of the wood grain as he lifted it, warm and dark and almost medicinal. Propolis. Bee glue baked into poplar over 40 years. It was the smell of his grandfather's canvas apron, and it hit him so hard he had to stand there holding the box a second before he could set it down. He pried the cracked lid off and looked inside. 2 frames of drawn comb out of 10. Still sound, still holding their shape. 2 out of 10 had survived. Page 43 did not stop at the underlined sentence. The paragraph beneath it read, "A swarm chooses a home by scent before it chooses by space. Clean wax, propolis residue, the ghost of brood. Give them the smell of a living hive, and they'll move in like they built it themselves." Setting the table. That was what the old man had called it. So Eli set the table. He put a dented stock pot on the stove with 3 inches of water in it and nested a smaller pot inside. And he scraped the 2 surviving frames down with a putty knife until the dark cappings and the pale virgin wax curled off together into the inner pot. The heat climbed slow. At 145 degrees, the wax went liquid and separated from cocoon silk and pollen dust and the bodies of bees that had been dead longer than he'd been alive. He strained it through a square of muslin stretched over a mason jar, and the gold pooled underneath clear as lamp oil. What was left in the muslin looked like wet sawdust. Anybody else would have thrown it out. He set it on the windowsill in a jar lid, because that residue held propolis, and propolis held the scent signature of his grandfather's original colony, and he intended to mix it back into the final coat. Then he painted the frames with a cheap bristle brush, thin and even, top bars and side bars and bottom bars, and the whole house filled up with the smell of beeswax and pine resin and something floral buried so deep in the chemistry you'd have sworn there were flowers blooming somewhere in the middle of March. But 2 frames don't make a hive. He needed 10 to a box, and he needed boxes that didn't leak wind. That took 3 weeks of afternoons in the barn. He worked with his grandfather's hand plane, the rosewood knob worn smooth in the shape of a palm that wasn't his, and a framing square with brass corners, and the stack of poplar from 1982 with the receipt still stapled to the top plank. He planed each board to 3/4 of an inch. He cut the finger joints by hand with a dovetail saw, because there was no table saw in that barn and he wouldn't have trusted himself on one anyway. The fit had to be tight. Bees will seal a gap with propolis, but they will not bother sealing a box that feels like a drafty room. Page 61 gave him the sealant. Pine resin off a scarred trunk behind the pond, heated in a tin can until it ran clear, cut 3-to-1 with melted beeswax, painted into every seam and every joint and every crack where wind might get a whisper through. When he was done, 11 boxes stood square on the barn floor, smelling like a forest floor after rain. Then he needed bees. He knew where they were. There was a hollow elm 2 miles up the ridge, hollow from 12 feet on up, with an entrance knothole about the size of a quarter, and a colony had been living in it for at least 3 winters, without a single chemical strip, or a drop of sugar syrup, or anybody importing its genetics from 1,000 miles away. He knew that tree better than any tree on Earth. There was a crescent scar on his left elbow that had come off one of its lower branches when he was 9. He watched them 3 days first, the way the journal said to. Their flight lines, their pollen loads, how quick they got defensive when he stood too close. He took the branch at dusk with a bow saw, slow strokes, the vibration coming back through the wood into his wrists, and the cluster drew itself tight as the limb came free. A dark knot of bees about the size of a football, humming at a pitch that dropped as the temperature fell. He lowered it into a pillowcase, tied it shut with twine, and walked 2 miles home in the dark with the fabric warm against his shoulder. The hum never stopped. It rose on the steeper grades like they could feel elevation. He shook them into a repaired box at the edge of the orchard, and he made the entrance 4 inches wide because he wanted them to feel welcomed instead of trapped. That was the mistake. By morning, the box was empty. Not a bee on the landing board, the entrance sitting open like a mouth with nothing left to say. He stood there in the wet grass before the bus came and understood for the first time the specific weight of what he didn't know yet. 3 days later, he narrowed that entrance to 1/2 inch with a strip of pine, barely wide enough for 2 bees to pass shoulder to shoulder, and he went hunting differently. Page 67 laid out the bait boxes. Lemongrass oil rubbed inside, 1 frame of old dark comb set at the center, hung 10 feet up in the tulip poplars. The comb was the whole trick. It smells like home to a swarm that hasn't got one. He climbed with a rope and a carabiner and the brass-hinged smoker banging against his hip, and he hoisted the boxes into the crooks of branches and left them. The first one filled on a Tuesday morning, and the sound of it was like a waterfall made out of static. He felt the vibration in the bark under his palm before he saw a thing. That colony stayed. He knew it had stayed because of the pattern out front. Bees don't leave a hive and shoot straight for flowers when they're memorizing a place. They hover facing the box and fly widening figure eights, mapping the whole world against one fixed point. He stood 3 feet back with the smoker cold on his belt and watched them write their loyalty in the air. Page 82 told him what came next. Mark the queen. White dot, non-toxic paint. You need to know where she is before you can know anything else. He mixed acrylic with water on a scrap of cardboard, found her on the 3rd frame by her longer abdomen and her deliberate walk through all that hurry, and touched the smallest dot to her thorax with a toothpick. A blue pickup slowed at the fence a week later. The driver leaned on his horn once, not urgent, just announcing himself. Hey! You playing farmer with a dead man's toys? Eli didn't look up from the frame in his hands. They're working. The man laughed and drove on, and dust settled on the fence posts, and Eli never mentioned him again. At school that spring, somebody started calling him B-Boy. He let it stand. It cost him nothing, and correcting it would have cost him something. 5 more swarms came into the bait boxes through April and May. 1 colony turned up queenless in June. No eggs, no larvae, the workers louder than they should have been. And page 91 told him to lay a single sheet of newspaper between that box and a strong one and let them chew through until the pheromones merged. 2 days later, there was confetti on the landing board, and 1 colony where there had been 2. 5 hives going into summer. In August, he pulled honey off all 5 and got 11 pounds. 11. The county average was 60 pounds per hive. Per hive. He wrote the number in the margin of the journal, pressing hard enough to dent the next page, and it landed directly beside a line his grandfather had written years before he was born. First year is tuition, second year is proof. Have you ever stood in a room where everybody talked about you, right in front of you like you weren't in it? September came, and September was the deadline. Denise had the letter from the Louisville law office in a manila folder on top of the refrigerator, and she had not touched it since March, and both of them knew exactly what was in it, and exactly how many months were left on the clock. 18 from the date on the letter, 6 of them gone. She came home off a double at 7 in the morning and found her son in the barn instead of in bed, and she stood in the doorway with her keys still in her hand the way she always did. So what did the season come to? He told her the truth, because there wasn't any version of it that sounded better. 11 pounds. His mother didn't yell. That was never her way. 11 pounds. That's about $90 retail, if a person could find somebody to buy it. And we are $31,000 short of keeping the ground under this house. I want you to say out loud that you understand the difference between those two numbers. I understand it. Give me the winter. She wanted to know what a winter was supposed to change, and he told her. And that was the conversation that turned everything. Because the bees had made honey, not much surplus, that was the 11 pounds. But they had packed their brood boxes with 60 pounds apiece of their own stores, capped and sealed and waiting. 5 colonies. 300 pounds of honey sitting out there in the orchard row in the dark. At $8 a pound retail, $2,400. Standard winter protocol in that county, the protocol every extension pamphlet printed and every association member followed, was simple and it was sensible. You pull the honey in August, you sell it, and you replace what the bees need with a 2-to-1 sugar solution. Cheap, effective, keeps them breathing until spring. Nobody in Hardin County did it any other way. Eli was proposing to leave every ounce of it in the boxes. Denise set her keys down on the workbench, which she almost never did. Explain to me, slowly, why $2,400 is going to spend the winter inside a stack of wooden boxes, while I work doubles. He didn't argue with her. He'd learned that much from the funeral. He picked the green journal up off the bench, turned it to page 19, and handed it to her open. His grandfather's handwriting, the letters leaning left, the pencil pressed hard. You don't steal their winter coat and hand them a blanket. She read it. She read the rest of the entry too, the part underneath, where Amos had worked it out the way he worked everything out. That sugar syrup is empty calories, that it keeps a colony alive without keeping it strong, that the difference doesn't show up in December, it shows up in February, when the queen starts laying again and the nurse bees need real protein reserves to make royal jelly. Feed them sugar, and you get a colony that stumbles into spring like a fighter after 12 rounds. Leave them their honey, and you get a colony that walks into spring like it owns the place. Denise stood in her father's barn holding her father's handwriting at 7 o'clock in the morning after 14 hours on a ward. What she said then was the truest thing anybody said in that whole year. I'm not afraid you're wrong, Eli. I'm afraid you're right, and that it still won't matter. I watched my daddy be right for 40 years, and it bought him 12 hives, a leaking roof, and a folding chair with nobody sitting in it. Then she put the journal down and went to bed, and she didn't say yes and she didn't say no. And Eli took that for what it was, which was the winter. He left them their honey. October turned the hills above the property to rust and copper, and by the first week of November, the maples were bare. He wrapped all 5 hives in black tar paper, cutting the sheets with his grandfather's heavy scissors, folding the edges tight against the wind, tying them off with cotton twine in the knot the journal illustrated on page 31, a modified clove hitch that wouldn't slip when the paper swelled in the rain. Every morning before the sky had any color in it, he walked the line in his boots and put the flat of his bare hand against the outer wall of each box. Not checking, listening. A healthy winter cluster runs about 92 degrees at its center. By the time that heat works out through 3 inches of wood and a layer of tar paper, what reaches a palm is barely warmth at all, like touching a window in a room where somebody left a lamp burning. If the wall is cool, the cluster has shrunk. If it's dead cold, you're already too late. He did that every single morning, 5 boxes, before the bus. Nobody in Hardin County knew he was doing it, and if they had known, not one of them would have called it anything but foolish. There was no miticide in those hives, no sugar, no queens shipped up from a breeding operation in Georgia in little screen cages. Nothing between 5 colonies and February except 300 pounds of their own honey, and the word of a man who had been dead a year. $2,400, sitting in the dark, not earning a cent. The checking account on the kitchen counter held a little under 1,000, and the manila folder stayed on top of the refrigerator, and the 18 months kept running. And neither of them mentioned it again until the ice came. He ran out of cotton twine in the second week of November and had to get into town for more, which meant Harlan's, because Harlan's was the only place inside 9 miles that sold it. He was 15 and he didn't have a license yet, so his mother dropped him at the door on her way into a shift and told him to be standing outside in 10 minutes. Dale Pomeroy was holding court at the front counter. You could spot the man from the parking lot. That gold B on his chest caught the fluorescent light every time he shifted his weight, and he had his weight back on his heels and his chin slightly elevated, talking to another beekeeper about the season the way a man talks when he's decided the whole store is his audience. Eli was 2 aisles over with a roll of twine in his hand when he heard his own name, or near enough to it. "Le Weathers boy will lose every colony he's got by March. No miticide, no chance. That farm's been running on stubbornness and fairy tales since the old man died." He didn't say it cruelly. That was the thing about it. He said it the way you describe weather. Then he turned, and he saw Eli standing there, and he did not look embarrassed for so much as a half second. He smiled, that patient half smile, the one that had been at the funeral. "Do you need me to explain what a mite is, son?" Eli had been reading his grandfather's inspection notes for 8 months. He could have told the man which abdominal segment of a developing larva the varroa mite prefers, and what the mite does to fat body tissue while it feeds, and why apistin resistance had been documented in that state before he was born. What he said was, "No, sir." He paid for the twine, and he went out, and he stood on the sidewalk and counted cars until his mother came. January came in mean. The ice storm rolled through in the second week, and it didn't announce itself. Just a slow thickening in the air all afternoon, and then a sound after dark like somebody pouring sand across glass. And by midnight, every surface on that farm wore a 1/4 inch of clear ice. The fence wire, the barn roof, the dead tobacco stalks, the tar paper on 5 hive boxes. Eli woke at 5 to a silence that felt wrong. He couldn't have said what was missing. Something in the pitch of the house. He pulled a thermal shirt on under his canvas work coat, laced his boots in the dark, and went out with a flashlight. And the ice broke under his soles with every step, like walking across a frozen puddle that went on for 200 yards. 2 of the hives were on the ground. The wind had gotten under the tar paper and caught it like a sail, and it had walked both boxes right off their stands. They lay cracked open on the ice, frames scattered across frozen mud. And bees, thousands of them, pouring out into 28-degree air, crawling in slow, confused circles across the ice with their wings too cold to vibrate, burning through the last of their reserves out in the open. A bee on the ground at 28 degrees has about 20 minutes before she can't move at all. He did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way he always did. 2 colonies, somewhere between 40 and 60,000 bees between them. 20 minutes. He set the flashlight in the crook of a fence post so the beam threw across the wreck, and he went to work. He righted the first box by feel because the light was bad and his hands were already going. He restacked the frames by weight and by memory, brood in the center, honey to the outside the way it had been. Then he got down on his knees on the ice with no gloves on. Gloves crush them. The journal said so on page 29, and his grandfather had said it out loud 100 times. And he scooped loose bees off the ground with his bare hands and pressed them back against the cluster. A handful at a time, over and over, until the ground in the beam of the flashlight was mostly just ice again. He packed fiberglass insulation into the split joints. He rewrapped both boxes in tar paper and tied them off in a clove hitch he could have done blind by then. He braced the stands with cinder blocks he carried 2 at a time from behind the barn. 4 trips, sliding the whole way. When he finished, the sky was going gray at the edge, and his fingers had stopped reporting anything at all, and both knees of his jeans were soaked through and stiffening. The school bus came at 6:40. He made it. He sat in the 3rd row with his hands jammed under his arms for the whole ride, and the feeling came back into them somewhere around the county line, and it came back the way it always does, which is worse than the numbness. He got off the bus 9 days later and knew something else had happened before he was halfway up the drive, because his mother's car was in the yard on an afternoon she should have been on shift. The envelope was on the kitchen table, face up, already opened. Louisville return address, the same law office. Denise was sitting in front of it with her coat still on. His uncle's attorney had written to advise that a party had come forward with an offer on the property in its entirety, not the 1/3 interest, the whole 38 acres. The letter was careful to note that no obligation attached to the communication, and that Mrs. Weathers remained free to purchase her brother's share at the appraised figure within the remaining term. It said the offer was being conveyed as a courtesy. At the bottom of the page was the line where the certified mail receipt had been signed for, his mother's name, in his mother's handwriting. She had signed for it. She hadn't opened it and thrown it in the trash and never mentioned it. She had stood at the door and signed for it and carried it inside and set it on the table where he would see it. She didn't say anything about it either. Not one word. "Have you eaten?" And she got up and washed the coffee cup that had been sitting in the sink since morning, and that was the whole conversation. The silence was the answer. That was what he understood, standing in that kitchen with his book bag still on one shoulder. She had stopped arguing with him because she had stopped believing the argument mattered. He went out to the barn. The 2 boxes he had rebuilt in the dark were still standing, braced and wrapped out at the edge of the orchard with the other 3. He hadn't been able to open them. You can't open a hive in January. You can put your hand on the wall and you can guess, and that is the entire extent of what a person is permitted to know for 4 months. He sat down on the workbench stool with the green journal in front of him and turned to page 43 and read the sentence he had read 300 times. A hive doesn't die. It gets abandoned. He still didn't know what the old man had meant by it. That was the part that sat on him. He had spent 10 months building boxes and rendering wax and climbing poplars and walking 2 miles in the dark with a pillowcase full of bees. And the one line the man had underlined twice, the line the whole notebook seemed to be built around, was the only thing in it he could not make sense of. The county extension office was 12 miles away. They had a bee specialist. They had a phone number printed on every pamphlet in the rack at the feed store, and Eli knew it without looking, because he had read those pamphlets standing up at that rack for an hour at a time. They had sugar syrup formulations and emergency winter feeding protocols, and miticide recommendations by product name and application window. They had people with degrees, people who had studied this, who would drive out to a farm in January if you called them, and who would look at 2 colonies that had spent an hour on the ice in 28-degree air and tell him exactly what to do next. All he had to do was call. All he had to do was say out loud to a stranger that the old man's system had not held. He took the phone off the wall in the kitchen and dialed 6 numbers. His thumb sat on the last one. He thought about the funeral, and the 29 folding chairs, and the 11 of them that were empty, and a man in polished loafers explaining kindly to a widow's daughter that her father had set the county back 20 years. He thought about the line on page 38 in that smaller handwriting. They had voted on me before I opened my mouth. And he thought about what happens the day after you call, not the phone call, the day after. The extension man writes it in a report. The report goes in a file, and by the 2nd week somebody at Harlan says the Weathers boy finally called for help. And Dale Pomeroy stands at that front counter with his clipboard under his arm and says, kindly, that he'd hoped the boy would come around sooner. And after that, It would never again be possible to prove anything to anybody.
Not because the bees would have died.
Because there would be nothing left to prove it with. He hung the phone up. He closed the journal and put it in his coat pocket and went outside. It was full dark by then, and the cold had that dry, hard edge that comes after a thaw refreezes. He walked the line of 5 boxes without a flashlight because he knew where every one of them stood. He put the flat of his bare hand against the first wall. Warmth. Faint. Barely anything at all, like the memory of a lamp. Second box. Warm. Third. Warm. Fourth. One of the 2 he had righted on the ice, and he had to hold his hand there longer than he wanted to, long enough that the cold started climbing his wrist. And then he felt it. Faint, but there. Fifth. Warm. Both of the tipped colonies had reclustered. He stood out there in the dark in the middle of 38 acres that 4 generations of his family had held on to, and he did not feel triumphant, and he did not feel saved. Because 5 faint spots of warmth in January prove nothing to anybody and cannot be shown to a lawyer. He just knew he wasn't going to call. 11 weeks until he could open a lid. He went back inside, and the manila folder was on the refrigerator, and the new letter was underneath it now, and his mother had gone to bed. He got the lids open on the 3rd Tuesday in April. The redbuds had come out along the creek, and the morning was warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, and he lit the smoker with dried pine needles and let it burn down until the smoke ran cool and white. His hands were steadier than he expected. He had thought about this morning for 11 weeks, and he had made himself stop imagining what he'd find, because imagining it didn't change it. He cracked the first inner cover and lifted a frame out into the light. Capped brood, wall to wall, in a tight, even pattern. Concentric rings of sealed cells radiating out from the center the way they're supposed to and almost never do. The queen was on the second frame he pulled, the white dot still on her thorax from the summer before, walking that slow, deliberate walk of hers through all the hurry. Pollen packed into the corners in bands the color of dandelion and wild mustard. He went through all 5. All 5 were alive. All 5 had laying queens. All 5 had stores enough to carry them to the flow. He didn't shout. There was nobody within a mile to shout at. He put the frame back, closed the box, went to the next one, and when he was finished, he sat down on an overturned bucket at the end of the row and let his hands shake for a minute. Which was the only celebration that morning got. Then he ran the test. A sugar shake is a crude thing, and it costs almost nothing. 300 bees in a jar with a screen lid, 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar, shake for 1 minute, tip the sugar out over a white pan and count what falls through with it. The mites let go and drop. It doesn't kill the bees. He did all 5 colonies and wrote the results in the margin of page 44 in pencil. The highest reading he got was 1.4 mites per 100 bees. The association's treated colonies, the strip colonies, the clipboard colonies, averaged 3.8, and that number wasn't a rumor. It was printed in the association's own seasonal summary, which went out to every beekeeper in the county, whether they were members or not, and Eli had a copy of it folded on the barn workbench. Overwinter survival across Hardin County that year came in around 55%. His came in at 100. He understood the why of it by then because the journal had been explaining it to him in pieces for 13 months. Nothing had propped those colonies up. Nothing had carried weak genetics forward into another generation. The bees that came through that ice storm came through because they groomed mites off each other's bodies, and uncapped cells where they smelled infection and hauled the damage out, and clustered tight on their own honey instead of on syrup. That is not luck. That is selection, running the way it has run for 60 million years. And all a person has to do to get it is stop interfering long enough to let it happen. He didn't tell anybody, not one person. What he did instead was sit down at the kitchen table with a sheet of lined paper and write it out. 5 colonies. 5 survived. Mite loads by hive. County figures beside his own. He signed the bottom of it with his full name. The way you sign something you intend to be held to. and he left it on top of the manila folder on the refrigerator where his mother would find it when she came off shift. She never said a word about it. But the paper was gone the next day, and a week later he found it folded in the pocket of her work bag. 5 months left on the 18. What happened between April and August of that second year happened faster than anything in his life ever had. He split every strong colony he owned. A walkaway split is 3 frames of brood, capped and uncapped, plus a frame heavy with honey, moved into a fresh box. The queenless half finds a larva young enough, floods it with royal jelly, and raises its own queen from scratch. Nature had been doing it since before there were people to watch. He just gave it the nudge. $0 in queens, $9 a box in lumber and hardware and wax he pressed himself in a mold he found hanging on a nail in the barn. $9. The association was paying $45 for a mated queen shipped up from Georgia in a screen cage, and requeening every colony that rejected her until it submitted. By the middle of June, he had 22 colonies standing in 2 rows along the eastern fence, every entrance facing east, because page 43 had a pencil sketch of exactly that layout with a compass rose drawn in the corner and 1 note beside it. East facing. Morning warmth puts foragers out 30 minutes earlier. 30 minutes across a season came to about 200 hours of flight time per colony. Eli underlined the number with his thumbnail and kept working. The flow that June was heavy. White clover came in so thick across the pasture edges it looked like snow from the road, and the black locust along the creek threw open clusters that smelled like honey before a bee ever touched them, and the tulip poplars dripped. He pulled 840 pounds in early August. That's 38 pounds a hive, which is conservative, which is the number you take when you're not robbing them into starvation. He uncapped with a heated knife in his grandfather's barn, the wax coming off in translucent ribbons, and he ran every frame through the hand crank extractor he'd rebuilt out of a rusted wreck in the corner. New bearings, a fresh basket, a repaired honey gate. He cranked until his right shoulder burned and then switched hands. No heat, no pressure filtering, just a double mesh strainer, and the pollen grains left suspended in it like tiny gold planets. 1,120 jars, 8 ounces each, filled the kitchen table, both counters, and 3 folding tables in the front room. He stamped every label by hand and wrote the source underneath in pen. Tulip poplar, clover, sourwood off the ridge slopes, pale and almost silver, the kind restaurants in Louisville pay real money for. Cost per jar in glass and lid and label came to 62 cents. He priced them at $12. His first market day was the second Saturday in August in Elizabethtown. He loaded 60 jars into a cardboard flat, set up a folding table with a hand-lettered sign, and put out 3 open jars with wooden stir sticks. For the first 40 minutes, people picked up a jar, turned it over, read the label, and asked him who he was selling for. "Who you selling for, hun? Is the owner around here anywhere?" 3 times, then a 4th. Eli was 16 years old. He had walked 2 miles in the dark with a colony in a pillowcase. He had knelt on ice at 5 in the morning with his bare hands. He had left $2,400 in a stack of boxes through a Kentucky winter on the word of a dead man. And every one of those jars had come out of that. The 5th time somebody asked, he didn't say, "It's mine." He put 1 finger on the bottom line of the label. Weathers Apiary, Hardin County. And then he touched the name stitched over the pocket of his work shirt. He didn't say anything at all. The woman's face went through about 4 things in 2 seconds. She bought 2 jars, and she was decent about it, and he told her thank you and meant it, because he had decided somewhere around the 3rd time that he was not going to spend his life being angry in public. 3 hours. 60 jars. Gone. $720 in a cigar box. He got home and opened the journal to the last page his grandfather had written on. A half-finished entry about queen genetics that stopped in the middle of a line. And underneath it, in his own handwriting, he wrote, $720, 60 jars, 3 hours. Then he sold like a man running out of time, Because he was. 4 Saturdays. 2 Louisville restaurants that called before the month was out and took cases without haggling over price. A specialty grocer in Lexington who put in a standing order for 60 jars a month, which was less than Eli wanted and more than he could comfortably fill, and never once asked him to come down. On an evening in the last week of that August, with the extractor still sticky in the barn, he put an envelope down on the kitchen table. Denise counted it twice, which took a while. It was not $31,000. It was a little over $8,000, and it had taken every jar he could put a label on in 5 weeks to get there. But $8,000 in hand, against 38 acres owned free and clear, is a number a bank will look at. She sat down with a loan officer that same week, a woman who had told her kindly, the winter after her father died, that there was no product for a property like that. And this time it went differently. Because this time, Denise Weathers walked in with a down payment, a nurse's steady wage, and 2 years of her son's ledgers in a folder. Ray was paid in full before the 18 months ran out. The petition was never filed. The land stayed. His mother didn't thank him. She sat down on the kitchen chair with the envelope still open in her hand and put her face down and cried. And Eli stood there and did not know one single thing to do with his hands. He'd kept the other half of the bargain, too. Every report card that came to that house went straight onto the refrigerator, under the manila folder, and not one of them had a thing wrong with it. The year finished at $13,400. Everything that came in after August went back into boxes and frames and foundation. By the 4th year, he was running 90 colonies, and revenue crossed $41,000, and he filed a return with a profit margin that would have made any farmer in that county sit up straight. He'd started at the community college in Elizabethtown that fall and dropped it after 1 semester, which caused an argument. And the argument ended when Denise looked at the ledger and stopped arguing. Have you ever stood in a room where everybody talked about you, right in front of you like you weren't in it? He was 19 years old, and he had never once raised his voice about any of it. Then, on a Tuesday morning in September of the 5th year, a white pickup pulled up to his gate. Clean, waxed recently. And Dale Pomeroy stepped down onto the gravel. Loafers on a farm road. He came to the fence with the clipboard tucked under his left arm and his weight back on his heels, and he smiled the way he always smiled. Been meaning to get out here a while now. Eli was in the orchard row with the smoker on his belt. He walked over, stopped on his side of the wire, and waited. The offer, as Dale laid it out, was generous, and he said that word himself. It's a generous offer, son. We've got shelf space in grocery chains across 3 states. Trucks. Purchase orders. Somebody else handling your accounts. You wouldn't have to think about a thing but bees. The terms were standard, he said, because they were the same terms everybody signed. Blend and bottle. The honey would go into the co-op's tanks with everybody else's, and it would come out under the co-op's house label, and the label would carry the co-op's name and not one word about where any of it had been made. $4.20 per unit, paid on delivery. Eli listened to all of it without moving, and he noticed something while the man talked. It was this. Dale had not once, in 9 years of association meetings, or funerals, or grocery store lectures, offered to buy the farm. He'd never wanted the ground. What he had driven out here to purchase, at $4.20 a unit, was the name off the jar. Keep the bees. Keep the method. Keep every pound of the yield. Just take those 2 words off the glass. Which was the same thing that had almost happened to that family on a courthouse step in a different form 4 generations deep. Nothing gets taken all at once. It gets taken in a way that sounds reasonable when a man says it out loud at a fence in good shoes. Dale finished. And when Eli still hadn't answered, he added the last part, the part he clearly thought would close it. You're young. This is about the best door you're going to get. Eli let him stand there in the sun a while longer. Then he gave his terms. $7 a jar, wholesale. The Weathers apiary label stays on every unit, unchanged. It never gets blended with another apiary's product, not 1 ounce, not in a short year, not ever. And every jar names the ground it came off of: Orchard Block, Creek Meadow, Ridgeland. The land gets credit. The bees get credit. The old man's work gets its name on the shelf. Dale stood there and did arithmetic behind his eyes. The co-op's standard contract was blend and bottle, $4.20 a unit, no origin listed. And here was a 19-year-old asking for nearly twice the price and total brand independence. And there was nothing on the clipboard under his arm that offered him a single argument. The farm's not for sale, Mr. Pomeroy. Neither is the name. Dale accepted, because he had no choice worth the name of a choice. That honey already outsold everything in the co-op's catalog. 2 grocery chains had started asking for it by name. People were driving 30 miles for it on a Saturday. He needed the Weathers place considerably more than the Weathers place needed him, and both men standing at that wire knew it. He put his hand out over the fence. Eli shook it once, and that was the end of it. Statewide distribution followed inside 4 months. The 6th year closed at $198,000. The 7th at $287,000. By the 8th year, there were 280 colonies humming across 3 sites, and the operation grossed $412,000, which made it the highest-grossing single-producer honey business in the state. No loans past the one his mother had signed. No chemicals. No imported queens, just propolis-stained canvas, a brass-hinged smoker worn to the shape of a dead man's fingers, and a green cloth journal he still opened every morning before he walked the rows. Tom Greenlee came up the drive one morning that spring. He farmed 3 properties east, and he had told his wife in the first month after the funeral that the Weathers place would be sold inside a year. He had an apple orchard on his south slope. 40 trees or so. The fruit had been coming in spotty for a long time. Poor pollination. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention what he'd said. "Can your bees work my trees during bloom?" $75 per hive placement, standard rate. Greenlee pulled his wallet out right there at the fence line and paid it without a word of haggling. A handshake, a nod. That was all of it. And that was enough. Money is a slower apology than words, and it is worth considerably more. That autumn, 3 association members quietly dropped their miticide protocols. No announcement, no vote, nothing said at a meeting. They went to foundationless frames, left the honey on, and stopped requeening out of Georgia. They lost 14 colonies between them that first winter, dead by February. And then they called him. Eli drove out and inspected all 14. He pulled a dead-out frame and tilted it toward the weak winter sun and ran a fingertip down the comb, and it came away dry. They hadn't died of mites. They'd starved. Every one of those men had left 30 pounds of honey per hive for winter stores, because 30 pounds was the standard recommendation in every extension pamphlet Dale Pomeroy had ever handed out at a meeting. Eli set the frame down and straightened up and looked at the nearest of them, a man who had told his grandfather out loud in a cinder-block room that his methods would bankrupt anybody fool enough to try them. "Leave 60. Don't steal their winter coat." He didn't explain thermal cluster metabolism or the caloric cost of a January cold snap or protein reserves and royal jelly in February. He gave the one instruction and let it sit there. The man nodded and wrote it on the back of his own hand with a pen out of his shirt pocket. The next winter, his surviving colonies came through fat and calm. The following spring, Dale Pomeroy retired from the association presidency. The meeting was held in the same cinder-block extension building where he had once explained to a room that the Weathers boy would lose everything by March. He stood at the podium and recommended that the membership adopt what he called the Weathers protocols for all new members. Foundationless frames, 60 pounds left on, Survivor stock, locally mated, no imports. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention the clipboard visits or the half smile or the way he used to say honey farming in that particular tone, like the words themselves were a joke a boy hadn't caught on to yet. He made the recommendation, set the clipboard down on the podium, and sat. That is how you beat a system. Not by arguing with it, not by fighting it. You build something so functional, so plainly and boringly productive that the system has nothing left to offer anybody. Dale Pomeroy wasn't a villain at the end of it. He was a footnote. 15 years after 11 broken boxes turned up at a fence in the dark, Elijah Weathers was 30 years old, and his hands didn't look like anybody else's in that county. The knuckles carried a permanent brown stain that no amount of scrubbing took out, and the calluses had gone shiny, and the crescent scar on his left elbow had faded down to almost nothing. That, or 20 years of orchard sun, had simply evened it out. The brass-hinged smoker still hung from his belt. Same one. Third pair of boots. Same style. Same red laces. His mother was 56 and had turned in her badge at the hospital 2 winters back. She sat most mornings on the porch of the house she'd grown up in and spent her whole young life trying to leave, with the apiary books open on her lap, because she kept them now. She was better at it than he was, and she said so. The boy came up the drive on a bicycle on a Tuesday morning in April. He was 14, thin through the shoulders, from the next county over. His father was one of the 3 men who had lost 14 hives that winter and picked up a phone, and who had written 6 words on the back of his own hand with a ballpoint pen. The boy had gotten it in his head to keep bees, and his father had told him where to go ask. Eli was in the orchard yard when he rode up. "How many are you thinking of running?" "I've got 2. One of them doesn't look right." So Eli reached into the pocket of his canvas apron and brought out the green cloth journal, the brass corner worn smooth as river glass. And he opened it to page 43, the page he had opened maybe 1,000 times. And he read it out loud. "A hive doesn't die. It gets abandoned." He knew what it meant now. It had taken him years, and he had never once been able to make it mean anything in a hurry. A colony that fails doesn't die of the mite or the cold or the wet spring. Those are just the weather. It dies at the moment the bees inside it stop keeping it. Stop drawing the comb, stop hauling out the damage, stop clustering tight when the temperature drops. And after that, the box is only a box, and the winter finishes what the leaving started. Land is exactly the same. So is a name. Nothing that matters gets taken all at once. It gets left, one season at a time, by people who got tired, or were told it wasn't worth what it cost, or were made to feel foolish for holding on. Amos Weathers never got tired. And neither, as it turned out, did his grandson. He handed the journal across. "Read the first 40 pages. Then we'll talk about what a hive needs before it knows it needs it." The kid took it and tucked it under his arm, and Eli walked him down to the nearest row and handed him the smoker and watched him light it and squeeze the bellows twice. And sweet white smoke curled up into the April air, and the boy went toward the colony without being told to. Eli went up on the porch and stood beside his mother's chair with his hands clasped behind his back. It was his grandfather's posture exactly. He didn't know that. Denise did, and she didn't say anything about it. Have you ever stood in a room where everybody talked about you, right in front of you, like you weren't in it? He never argued with a single one of them. Not the man in the blue pickup, not the kids at school, not the woman at the market who asked who he was selling for, not the president of the County Beekeepers Association standing at a counter in Harlan's asking, slowly, whether he needed the word might explained to him. He just counted. And then the whole county had to read that name every time they opened a cupboard. The orchard was loud that morning. 300 yards of dark, rich ground ran out from the porch steps, ground that had been pale as ash the spring the boxes turned up, and every row of it hummed. They dumped somebody else's garbage at a 15-year-old boy's fence because they didn't want to pay $75 to throw it away. And they never once looked back to see what he did with it. He turned it into the thing they had to buy back from him, under the very name they used to smile at. A hive doesn't die. It gets abandoned.